Welcome to Casual Friday. Hi, I'm Roxanne Richardson, and this is my weekly Casual Friday podcast. In this week's podcast, I have tidbits. I'll give you a spinning update, and I'll introduce you to a new knitting project that I'm really having a lot of fun with. So let's get started. This tidbit came from Elsie's, I think it is their name, on Ravelry. It's a link to an episode of a podcast that I've been listening to on and off for about the past year. It's called The History of the English Language Podcast. The first episode of the podcast began more than 10 years ago, and it started with the Proto-Indo-European language, which is the root language that spawned so many languages spoken throughout the world, including English. So you don't need to listen to every single episode in sequence before listening to the one that's of particular interest today. But you might find that when you do listen to it, that it's so interesting you want to go back and start over with episode 1. So this episode is episode 110, titled Dyed in the Wool. And it first aired in April of 2018. So as a side note, I'm currently on episode 40 when he's just getting into Old English. But earlier this year, I started to also listen to new episodes as they come out, which is about every 4 to 5 weeks at this point. And now he's gotten into modern English and has been discussing Elizabethan English and Shakespeare. So in 10 years, that's how far he's gotten. It's incredibly full of information and all sorts of history. One of the things I love about this podcast is that the evolution of language and how it pertains to English is presented in the context of what was going on historically in Europe in terms of who yielded power and where, how people migrated from one place to another, and how that intermingling of cultures caused languages to change. And it's really connected a lot of dots for me in terms of I know this little factoid and that little factoid, and oh, that's how those things actually connect together and things begin to make sense. So let me read to you the description of what this particular episode, Dyed in the Wool, is about. In this episode, we explore the important role of the wool and cloth industries in medieval England. Not only was England a major producer of sheep and wool, it also developed its own cloth industry in the 1300s. This was also a period in which clothing fashions were undergoing some major changes. We examine the ways in which clothing was changing, and we look at the cloth making process. We also explore lots of words and phrases related to the traditional wool and cloth industries. So the episode is about an hour long. I was listening to it while I was spinning this morning, and I think I'm about 45 minutes into it. I really think you guys are going to like it. And even if you decide not to listen to any other episodes, I think you're going to really like this one. And of course, I will leave a link down in the show notes. This tidbit came to me from my YouTube recommendations. It's a video that demonstrates a Revolutionary War era great wheel. It's about 10 minutes long, and it's one of the better ones I've seen of people doing demonstrations on the great wheel. The audio and video quality are really good, and the person interviewing the spinner turns out to have actually had prior experience spinning on a treadle spinning wheel, which made this whole conversation between them much better, in my opinion. There are so many pieces of equipment that are textile related that I want to try, but I just don't want to have to buy the equipment. And this is one of those things. I don't have room for a great wheel in my house, and I doubt I would want to use it on an ongoing basis. I just want to try it. So there are lots of ways for a modern spinner to produce the kind of yarn that a great wheel produces, which is a woolen spun yarn. And it's the yarn that I'm spinning on my good old Lendrum double treadle spinning wheel over there across the room from me. And I tend to be an equipment minimalist. I don't have this huge collection of knitting needles, for example, because I use a 32-inch circular needle to knit just about everything, regardless of how narrow or wide it is. I just want to try a great wheel to see kind of what it feels like, because the spinning process is just different. We do have living history museums here in Minnesota, but they're typically demonstrating life in the mid-19th century when Europeans began settling in this part of the continent. And then therefore the spinning wheels that they're demonstrating on are treadle wheels, not great wheels. I'm sure there are spinners around here in the area, the Twin Cities, who have great wheels. I just don't know who they are. And I don't know that they would want me touching their antique spinning wheel. The Weavers Guild, I think, does have a great wheel. Or they did when I was first learning to spin, and I didn't really understand what it was. But I don't know if it's in working order, and if it is, what the rules are around who is allowed to use it. So I'm going to have to contact them and find out, because I really want to try it. Otherwise, if you are in the Twin Cities or in the Minnesota area and you know of somebody who has a great wheel who'd let me have a go on it, let me know down in the comments. But I will leave a link to the video on the great wheel down in the show notes. This tidbit came to me physically from my friend Tina, who recently retired and moved to Colorado. She was back in town this month for a couple of weeks to spend time on several of Minnesota's more than 10,000 lakes. We're actually called the land of 10,000 lakes, even though it's more like 12,000. We have a lot of lakes. But at any rate, Tina had read a book that she thought I might be interested in and dropped it by it dropped by the house to give it to me. And it is a book that I had been interested in since the beginning of this year when it first came out. I'd been hearing people in my various knitting groups talking about it, and I thought about checking it out from the library, but there was this huge waiting list to get the book. The author is Peggy Orenstein. She's a Minnesota native. She grew up in St. Louis Park, which is a suburb of Minneapolis, literally just a few blocks from where I live. And my husband grew up there, and my friend Tina, who gave me the book, grew up there as well, and in fact graduated from high school with Peggy Orenstein back in, I think, 1979. The fact that Peggy Orenstein is originally from here is probably the reason why there was such a long wait for the book at the library. I don't think you would have that problem in other locations necessarily. She doesn't live here in Minnesota anymore. She lives in Northern California, and she's written a number of books, not about knitting, but she has been a lifelong knitter. She was on a book tour for her most recent book when the pandemic hit, and which interrupted the book tour and her life, like it did for pretty much everyone. And while she was at home doing a lot of knitting, she decided to embark on a project that I believe that she had been thinking about for years, which is sort of a sheep to sweater project, where she would shear a sheep herself, process the raw wool, learn to spin, to make the yarn herself, learn to dye it using natural dyes, and then she'd have to learn to design a sweater for that yarn she created, and then to knit it up. Up to that point, the only experience she had of all of those was with knitting using commercially spun yarn. So she had never designed a sweater herself, nor had she done any spinning or dyeing, and she certainly had never sheared a sheep. So in the book, she shares aspects of her background, her relationships and her daily life, and how they affect her as she's taking this journey. And I think the one aspect of the project that I wouldn't have thought to do myself is to learn how to shear a sheep. I love watching sheep get sheared, but it isn't something that I would think myself capable of learning to do at my age, which is nearly the same age as Peggy Orenstein. She's a year older, but she sheared the sheep a couple of years ago, but so basically the same age. So good for her for learning to do that. And it was not easy. She the way she described it did not make me want to run out and do it as well. I'll leave an Amazon link to the book down below. I'm sure at this point, if you live, especially if you live somewhere outside of the Twin Cities, if you want to get it from the library, you probably won't have the kind of wait list that we were dealing with here in Minnesota. So finally, for the first time since 2019, I am going to the Minnesota State Fair. I'll be taking lots of footage of the items on display in the Creative Activities building, particularly the knitting, because we do have the largest knitting competition of any state fair in the country. It's really amazing. It's an amazing sight to behold. So I'll also take footage of other creative activities within the building, as well as footage of other parts of the fair, so that you can get an idea of what it's like to be at the Minnesota State Fair. I mentioned a couple of weeks ago that our guild was doing a group entry in a contest that takes place in the horticulture building for Christmas tree decorating. But we realized that we hadn't given ourselves time to accumulate enough knitted items to decorate the tree. The idea is to decorate it with little miniature knitted sweaters and accessories and pom-pom garland. So we are going to spend the next year knitting those items for next year's fair. Because I know some of you said, oh, make sure you take a picture of that. Oh, so we're not doing that this year, just so you know. But if you happen to be going to the Minnesota State Fair this year, I will be at the Knitters Guild's demonstration booth in the Creative Activities building on Monday, August 28th from noon till 3. And I'll be at the Weavers Guild, their demonstration booth on Thursday, August 31st from 1 p.m. till 5 p.m. Both demonstration booths are in the same area of the building. It's like a square demonstration area. The Weavers Guild has half of it, and then there's always two other organizations demonstrating in the other half. So if you know where one of those demonstration booths is, you can find the other one. So I'm really excited. I just can't wait. I'll be looking forward to it all weekend. I have just a quick update for you on my color experiment with spinning. Last week I showed you the 3 yarns I had made where I had mixed some color in with a light gray. So I knit up those swatches for those 3 yarns, and so I'm going to show those in the overhead in just a second. But to refresh your memory, I mixed 1.5 ounces of gray with 1/2 ounce of colored roving. So it's a 3-to-1 ratio. And I spun that wool up into 3 separate bobbins. So each of those bobbins had about 2/3 of an ounce of singles. And then I carded another ounce of just the gray and spun that up into 3 separate bobbins, each with 1/3 of an ounce of singles. And then I made 3 3-ply yarns. One was made from 3 singles of the color mix. One was made from 2 singles of the color mix and 1 single of gray. And the last one was made of 1 single of the color mix and 2 singles of the gray. So I wanted to see, you know, how that differed, what effect that would have. So anyone who's ever knit with a variegated yarn knows that you really can't predict what a variegated yarn will look like once it's knit up. So let's go to the overhead and I will show you the results. So this is what's left of the 3 original yarns. So this is the one, they all had 3 plies. This one, all 3 singles had color in them and a lot of gray. So each of the singles had 3-to-1 gray to color. This is the one where it had 2 singles that were 3-to-1 gray to color, and then 1 single that was just gray. And then this is the one where it had 1 single that was 3-to-1 gray to color, and then 3 plain grays. So no strands of gray, 1 strand of gray, 2 strands of gray. So these are the 3 swatches. This was interesting to me, that just the way that the singles ended up aligning, because I spun them, you know, on 3 different bobbins, that there were some places where, you know, all of the, or two or more of the strands had a bunch of color in them. And so I ended up with a couple of stripes. And so that isn't something that I could necessarily plan using the technique that I did. And it's pretty. I like the blue. So it is pretty. This one has got mostly just some rust in it. There's a little bit of blue at the bottom and the top. It's not as pretty, and it just kind of has this one random stripe in there. And again, I don't know how much I could control that. And then this one has the least amount of color, but it just feels like it's more dispersed, and that's because there was only one strand that might have be laying down color at any particular time. So this one is my preference with this experiment. I don't know that I could replicate this again, but that's my preference with this experiment. And I would like to try this again, trying a slightly different technique, and also trying this with the main color being much darker, and then adding the pops of color and seeing how that affects the results of what's going on. And to give me an idea of, you know, if the main color is light versus medium versus dark, for example, what does that do to all of this? So, you know, and so part of this is the, you know, the technique of just applying the color while I'm creating the bat, and some of it is the technique of how many strands that include color are going to be plied together. So it would be also interesting to see what the difference was if it was a 2-ply. You could either have both be color or one be color. I don't tend to like to knit with 2-ply, and so that wouldn't be a yarn that I would prefer to knit with, and so I would not be as likely to want to make a yarn like that. So what I learned was that I have a preference for more evenly dispersed pops of color rather than intense areas. At least within this experiment, my preference, that's where my preference leaned, which surprised me. So I think in the future, I might prefer using one single with color in it, and then using other singles that are solid as well. I'm not sure what ratio of the solid color to the main color to the added color would be for that one single. And I also think I would modify the technique that I used to add the color in while I was carding it. I was applying it directly to the carding cloth on the drum carder as I was kind of cranking the carder, just kind of laying it on in very specific spots. But sometimes I just applied it a little bit too thick, and it didn't open up the fiber enough when I was spinning, and so it made those sections of spinning a little trickier because I was spinning long draw, which kind of requires the fabric to be pretty loose so that it can just easily pull out. So in the future, I would either be more careful about how much I laid on the carder at any given time, or I would actually run small pieces of the color through the carder in the regular way to feed it in, so that the carder would open up those fibers a bit more, and just try to see if I could control where it ended up in the bat on the carder. I don't know. It's going to be experimenting. I also think that mixing the colored roving with light gray just kind of weakened the effect of the color pops. So they did end up being pretty muted. So I would prefer, you know, having evenly dispersed little bits of color but that ones that really popped. And I might only be able to get that if I have a darker base color and then add those pops of color. So my goal is to just learn how to create yarn that is going to work with the types of projects that I tend to knit. So fractal yarns and marled yarns are really pretty in the skein. And when I looked at those individual skeins, the one that had 3 colors I thought was really pretty. But I'm the kind of knitter who wants the stitch pattern to do the work and not the yarn. at least when it comes to projects like sweaters. In other areas of spinning, I have been working on spinning yarn for my first hand spun sweater project, and I'm still plugging away on that. I haven't figured out how I'm going to dye it or what colors I'm going to dye it, or I haven't figured out anything about what the sweater is going to be looking like. I'm just focused on the spinning for it right now. And I probably won't be spinning that yarn at my state fair demo, just because when you're demoing, you have to start and stop a lot. You're talking to people, you're demonstrating things, they ask questions, and you want to be able to show them. And so I'm not going to be creating yarn that I'm even probably going to want to use during the course of the demo. So yeah, just whatever yarn comes out of that day is probably going to get thrown in the scrap pile. That's my guess. I started a new knitting project earlier this week, which I'm having a lot of fun with. You may remember that a couple of weeks ago, I said that I would be starting back doing Technique Tuesday videos this fall in September. So my plan is that I will continue doing just one video per week as I've been doing this summer, but I'm going to be alternating between doing a technique video one week and a Casual Friday video the next week. I'm going to keep them on their designated days, Tuesdays and Fridays. I'd ask you guys if you had a preference, like if there's only one video per week, would you always want it on the same day, or would you prefer that they be left on their original days? And most people said leave them on their original days, or you do what works for you. And what works for me is to keep them on their original days. So what that means is that on September 1st is a Friday, and so that will be a Casual Friday. And then the following Tuesday, which is 4 days later, will be Technique Tuesday. And then 10 days later, on September 15th, will be Casual Friday. So, it's not exactly a week apart, but they are on alternating weeks. So that's the plan, at least for the short term. I'll see how that works. There may be times when I need to only do Casual Fridays again for a few weeks, or maybe the Casual Friday is not going to be possible. I'm traveling and it's easier for me to do Technique Tuesdays, record a bunch of them ahead of time and then just have those go out. I don't know. We'll see how it goes. As I've been planning for what technique videos I want to do this fall and thinking about what sorts of swatches or projects would be best to demonstrate the techniques on, I realized that at least for the first 6 technique videos of the fall, I could incorporate 6 ideas all within a single project, and that project would be a toddler-sized sweater. So some of the techniques will be specifically about how to handle certain aspects of sweater knitting, but other techniques will apply to any sort of project, just general knitting knowledge and techniques, but I'll just be using the sweater to demonstrate those techniques on, or use it as an example. I've really missed doing technique videos this summer, and I realized once I decided on this sweater project that I've really missed sweater knitting. I got a little burned out on sweaters from doing my long-term sweater project where I knit a sweater from each decade from the 1890s to the 1990s. And I finished the last one just about a year ago. I did knit a sleeveless linen top earlier this summer, but I kind of don't count that as a sweater for some reason. But I want to go to the overhead and show you this little project that I'm working on and tell you a little bit about how this project is going to be part of my plans for Technique Tuesdays this coming fall. So I'm going to go through this, I hope, fairly quickly. I hope I don't go on for too long. And you guys can let me know if there are certain things you are more interested in that you would like to know more about. Because there's kind of 2 things going on here. There's me designing a sweater for a toddler, and there's me designing a sweater that I can use to demonstrate techniques in videos. The 2 goals are not typically something that most knitters have. So I don't know which aspects might be more interesting to you. But anytime you want to knit a sweater, you have to know what kind of yarn you're going to knit. You need to know what sweater you're going to knit and what yarn you're going to use. Some people start with the yarn and then decide what the yarn wants to be. They find the right pattern for that yarn. I typically start with my idea and then find the yarn for it. And in this situation, it's kind of happening at the same time. I didn't know specifically what sweater I was going to knit, but I did know a few things about the sweater. Number one, it was going to be for a toddler. Number two, I was going to be videotaping it. So the yarn needed to be able to show up well on camera. When I'm making projects for myself, the yarns that I choose don't necessarily do that. So I was going into this knowing that this would be something that would be photographed. So I needed to pick a color that I knew that I liked, but also would show up well. And I needed to pick up a yarn that was appropriate for a toddler sweater. I typically knit with non-superwash wools. For a toddler, I want something machine washable. So I didn't know specifically what sweater I was going to be knitting, but I knew a few things about it. I knew I was going to be knitting it bottom up seamlessly, that it would be probably a raglan, maybe a circular yoke, but it would be one of those two styles. It wouldn't be drop shoulder or modified drop, certainly not set in sleeve, because there was a specific technique I wanted to demonstrate at the underarms. So those are the things that I knew. So I needed to pick out yarn. I knew I probably only needed 2 skeins of worsted weight or DK yarn, like 200 grams of it, that would probably be enough. I like to have more yarn, and I was going to be demonstrating swatches and things on camera. So I bought 3 skeins of this. I bought 2 to use for the sweater, and then 1 to mess around with and just have as extra in case I was cutting it too close with the amount that I bought for the sweater. This particular yarn is Plymouth Select Worsted Merino Superwash. I don't usually use Merino and I don't usually use Superwash, but that's what I got here. And this seems entirely appropriate for the sweater that I want to knit. The next step was choosing the pattern. For myself, lately I've been either using vintage patterns or I'm designing something myself or reverse engineering it. So I've knit enough sweaters for myself. I know what my measurements are. I know how I like things to fit. I know what kind of elements I like. And so I don't have to worry about the silhouette and the measurements. I know what I need from myself. But for a toddler, I don't have a toddler in the house that I can measure and make something to fit them. So this is the kind of resource I will turn to, particularly for kids, but it can be used for anyone. You can get sweaters with a finished circumference of 26 inches up to 54 inches. So they have children's sweaters from 26 to 34 inches and then adult sweaters from 36 to 54. And they have all kinds of sweaters. They have drop shoulder, modified drop shoulder, set in sleeve, saddle shoulder. Those are all in this book, knit flat, bottom up, in pieces, and then seamed. They have raglans and circular yokes that are also knit bottom up, but those are knit seamlessly. So I you can look on here to see, which section they've got modified drop, set in sleeve. So I was looking for the raglan section. Particularly what I'm interested in are the schematics. So this is the schematics for the child sizes. It gives you all the information like the circumferences or the widths or the depths, all of that sort of thing for all of the different sizes. So what I do is I choose the size I want and then I transfer all this information. I just create my own schematic myself. So this type of pattern in this book, it is meant all of these different sizes, but also you can knit at all these different gauges. So then they tell you, like, this is the yarn requirements, but then they tell you if you have, a gauge of 4 stitches per inch and you want to do a 36 inch sweater, then you would cast on this many stitches. And so it's a different layout for sweaters patterns than you are used to in other things. But once you get used to how this works, it can work really well. So I transferred all of the information on here with all of the measurements. I didn't know yet if I wanted to do a crew neck or a V-neck. So I put both of the information for both of those in there. And then I took a look at what information is missing from the schematic that I would need. There are a couple of things. One is at the underarms. This is something that the reason I'm knitting this kind of sweater is because I want to demonstrate something to do at the underarms to eliminate the holes. I did a video on this last year for top-down seamless sweaters that people really liked, and I was immediately asked by a number of people in the comments, can you do one for bottom-up? So that was one of the reasons for choosing this style of sweater specifically, is for that purpose of doing that kind of video. So you can't tell from the schematic how wide that underarm span is. So I had to look at the chart for that. And because I hadn't decided if I was going to do a crew neck or a V-neck, I was interested in how she proportioned the crew neck sweater. The back of the neck is 4 inches wide. That means the front of the sweater is going to start with that same 4 inches worth of stitches, and you get rid of them, but at what rate? So how many initially are bound off in the center and on the subsequent rows, and then how many decreases. So I like to look at those proportions just to see what they are, and if they differ from what I'm used to, say, for an adult. And I don't always know those off the top of my head. So I was just curious about how those were laid out in this particular book. And so I needed that information. And then I started laying out ideas that I had. One of my ideas for a video came from my daughter, who had asked me about this recently. I didn't have a video to show her on how to do like a tubular or grafted bind off for twisted ribbing. And so I knew that I wanted to do twisted ribbing for this, which will be at the cast on edges, but I would also use it around the neck. And then I could demonstrate that in one of the videos. I have another technique that I've been using for the past year or so for knitting a fake in the round swatch that's different from how I'd been doing it for 15 years. And I've been wanting to do that for a video. And since this is knit in the round, I will do that as well. So other things that I wanted to do was add a stitch pattern. This is a plain stockinette pattern, so I wanted to add a stitch pattern, and I wanted to think about, well, what kind of stitch pattern would I want to add? Would it be an all over stitch pattern, or would it just be, say, in a front panel? And I decided that because I'm doing twisted ribbing, that I would do a front panel that had traveling twisted stitch patterns. So then I go to my next resource, which are my books on traveling twisted stitch patterns. These are both in Bavarian German. This set of booklets has been compiled into one volume and translated to English by Schoolhouse Press. And there isn't really a whole lot of text in here. It's mostly charts and how to read those charts to create these different stitch patterns. These are very different charts than what we typically see nowadays. So you have to learn how to read those charts, and there is a little bit of text in here every once in a while that could be translated if you needed it to be. So I like these books, and then I have another 3-volume set. I've only got 2 of the volumes here, called Bauerlich Stricken, again, Bavarian German. This has a lot more information in here about the history of these stitch patterns and the people who were knitting them. And this has not been translated, but if you have a phone, a smartphone, and you have Google Translate, you can just hold it over the page and get the gist of what they're saying. When I first got these books, I had to type all of the information into Google Translate to try to figure it out, and then rely on a friend who's a German translator to help me with the particularly tricky parts. But both of these have a lot of the same patterns. This one, I think, has got more things, particularly things that were worn in women's stockings, more lace with twisted stitch patterns. So I looked through here, and I did find a stitch pattern that I liked, which was this one. Is these tulips here. I like this a lot. I looked at, well, how many stitches are there? 16 across, and the repeats 24 rows. So I had to think about how is that going to fit in the sweater in terms of the amount of space I have between the ribbing and the base of the neck. Is that going to fit nicely vertically since there's such a long repeat? And do I need to add additional columns of twisted stitch patterns in order to fill up the whole width of the neck? So I charted some things out, and then I did a swatch. So this is a yarn that I don't normally use, most worsted weight wools. I know what needle size I need to get 5 stitches per inch. But with superwash wool, it behaves a little differently. So sometimes I need to experiment, and I found that the size 6 needle was giving me too many stitches per inch, so I switched to a 7. So I got that established. And then I laid out the stitch pattern to see how I liked it, if I liked the way it looked, and to measure the gauge, because this was going to be different than stockinette, and that was what I needed to find out, is how different it was. And here you can see the method of fake in the round swatching that I was using, where you don't have those long strands going across the back. So I got that laid out, and then I had this idea of, extending the twisted stitches up the edge of the neck and also along the raglan lines. I thought those would be nice touches. So I have all of my ideas, I have my gauges, and then I can lay it out in the software that I use for charting. And I like to not just do charts of the stitch pattern, I like to lay the whole thing out and write notes on it and kind of see how the shaping is going to work out. So I could see how the shaping for the neck was going to intersect with the shaping for the raglan lines. I had to recalculate the shaping rate here because I had more stitches in this 4-inch span with this stitch pattern. So that meant I had to decrease out more stitches. So I also wrote notes about what I wanted to do with the underarms. I wanted to do bind offs at one underarm of the body and the sleeve, and on the other keep those live, so that when I do my videos I can have both of those to demonstrate on. So this just gives me the layout of what I'm going to do in the front. The rest of it's all in stockinette, so I don't have to chart it out in this way. But when I'm using stitch patterns like this and all this shaping, I really want to be able to see, get a bird's eye view of what's going on. So once I did that, then of course I did a spreadsheet, because I always create a spreadsheet before I work a project. This is a me thing. This isn't a requirement. This is something I like to do. And so it lays out the pattern in terms of the stitches that I need. Any sort of shaping will be in there, and I'll calculate the difference in the number of stitches that I should have. So I know on any particular row how many stitches I should have, and I can compare that to what's on my needles. I keep a running total of how many stitches I've been worked, and that's for me really important when I'm designing something myself, to make sure that I'm going to have enough yarn, so that when I get to the end of the first skein, I can see how many stitches I got out of it and make sure that I've purchased enough yarn, because early in the project you're more likely to be able to get more of the same dye lot. So I did my spreadsheet, I got my everything charted out. That was so much fun, and that was first 2 days of the week. And then I cast on for the sweater. Getting close to the underarm, I'm about 1.5 inches away. Then I will be doing the sleeves, and I'm going to be starting to record techniques for the technique videos. So that is, I wanted that to be quick. It took a little bit longer than I expected, but if there's any aspect of what I'm doing here that is of interest to you, or if you have questions about it, I can address those in future Casual Friday videos, or even in technique videos, depending on what the question is and what my answer will be. Well, that's it for this week's Casual Friday. If you have any comments or questions about today's video, or suggestions for videos you'd like to see in the future, you can leave those down in the comments below, or join the discussion in my Ravelry group, Rox Rocks. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.